Welcome back to another episode of Upstate and Litigate. I'm Derek Spada from Basch, Keegan, and Spada.
Hi, good afternoon, Maureen Keegan from Basch, Keegan, and Spada.
Hello, Eli Basch.
Today's topic is expert witnesses and how to use them to strengthen personal injury cases. There's various types of experts that we'll talk about today. Accident reconstruction experts, medical malpractice experts, playground experts, slip and fall experts, the list goes on, vocational, and so forth. We'll cover each of these topics today and explain to you when you really should have an expert witness, when you absolutely need one, and sometimes when you don't need one. So let's start by covering the different types of expert witnesses.
Well, I'm very familiar with the need to have an expert in a medical malpractice case. The statutes require that you consult with a medical expert who does this type of practice and confirms that after they've had an opportunity to read the records, that there was what they consider a deviation from good and accepted practice, and as a result, the client is injured. And, sometimes people think that they have a great case, and it turns out it isn't a case, and other times it doesn't seem like a case, but when we send it out for expert review, we find out the opposite. Right, Eli?
Yeah, well, one of the ones I remember very well is a person came in, a young fellow, football player, had a problem, had arthritic damage in his ankle, and was wondering why it was missed at a local hospital when he first came in. And then we go through the case, and what it came to was that it sounded kind of like a case, but he went to the hospital he went for a sprained ankle, and as it turned out from the medical expert, the deviation was they didn't take his temperature. Now, would your mother take your temperature for a sprained ankle? But the standard of care was when you come to the emergency room, you have your temperature taken, and the reason you do that is to see if there's an infection in your system, and he had an infection in his system, and what happened was that the infection continued to get worse. It was in his ankle, and that was a deviation from good and accepted medical care, and he violated the standard, and it took the doctor, our expert witness, to tell us that.
Right, because we when I met with this guy, he looked as healthy as a horse. He was a football player at a Division I school, and I kept thinking, this doesn't sound like a case to me. He had a sprained ankle, and they missed it. I don't know. But it turns out that small step in the emergency room, which is required, which is a standard of care, was missed, and therefore they couldn't determine that he actually had an infection within his entire body, and that's what caused the destruction of the cartilage in the ankle and precluded his football career.
Yeah, it was like on a Saturday, he went to the ER, and he was going back to school for practice on Monday, and they picked up on Monday. So it was like a short delay, but when he went to football practice, his ankle was bothering him, and it was hot, and they sent him to a doctor, and they diagnosed the infection. But that delay caused the damage, and it eroded the joint. And it was a case, and simply put, they didn't take his temperature in the emergency room for a sprained ankle.
And it's such a simple myth, such a simple concept.
Right.
But if you're not an expert in that field, like us, we wouldn't know that. Most people wouldn't really know that offhand to take their person's temperature. But the expert knew that and pulled the case together.
Yeah, right. So it's kind of interesting. And expert witnesses, they could be all manner, all different kinds. Can be a PhD or even a post-PhD expert. On the other hand, it could be the plumber. Would explain things to the jury as to what went wrong here, what the mistake was. Sometimes it's an engineer, sometimes it's a doctor, sometimes it's an economist. All accident reconstruction, the speeds of vehicles, it's a whole different world. And the old cliche is that what's an expert? It's somebody who has a suit from out of town and gets paid a lot of money.
They do get paid a lot of money.
They do. But it's really critical to find, I'll say, the right expert or an excellent expert for your case because, well, one, they're expensive, as you mentioned, and there's nothing worse than spending thousands of dollars on an expert who ultimately turns out to not be worth it. And an expert who doesn't come through for you or stretches the truth or says things that aren't quite correct can make your case unravel quickly.
Right. And I always tell people I don't try to hire any experts that aren't actually either practicing medicine, working as an engineer, or not just standing in their ivory tower throwing rocks at their cohorts or other people they work with. You want people who know what it's like to be in the working situation and what happened. That's
our side. Now, the defense uses expert witnesses also. And sometimes they'll get medical witnesses who'll tell you that the person in the graveyard's doing fine. And they have no permanency and they healed well. Meanwhile, they're out in Montrepose Cemetery. But for the right dollar, They'll tell you anything, and I know some notable ones swing both ways, and they're very articulate. They convince juries, and they'll give opinions, and they're bought and paid for, and it happens. Not on our side, but the defense, they have their own, I'd say, like, expert
Cadre.
bank that they can go to any time,
The
and
book of
they pull
experts.
them out.
Yeah.
And we get to cross-examine them, though. So the cross-examination of an expert is one of the more challenging things we do as trial lawyers, is that the person sometimes can be extremely skilled in an area that we're not particularly familiar with, and we have to study up on the technicalities, on the science, and review all the records, review sometimes the articles that they've written, which
Experts,
sometimes are contrary to what the opinion they're giving in court is. And sometimes they get paid a lot of money, and the jury is interested in how many millions and millions of dollars the experts have been paid over the years. I cross-examined one doctor last summer that I've been cross-examining for
40 years.
yeah, almost 40
Literally.
years.
Yeah, literally.
And by his own testimony, going through what he got paid and he was a doctor, had a medical practice as well. He was a good doctor in his day. But over 40 years, I had him testify that he got well over $20 million for giving his opinions. And
That's probably low. That's probably a low estimate.
That's out of his mouth. It's probably $40 million. And it was shocking to the jury, just incredible. But this is what happens. You get expert witnesses against you. And on the other side, us in regular injury cases, we get treating physicians as our expert witnesses to testify as to our client's injuries, damage, as to what the treatment was. And the doctors on our side often take pride in ownership, and they say how they did such a good job that the client with the major fracture and the joint that was destroyed is doing really well.
No problem. You don't have any disability now. You're going to be great. You can become a tap dancer after that. Yeah.
Yeah,
No.
some doctors have bigger egos, and they they'll pat themselves on the back to their their patient's detriment.
And they also don't like to be around lawyers. So when we ask them to come into the courtroom, even if they truly believe our client, truly believe they're hurt, they'll be like, no, it's not worth it for me. So sometimes we have to video or Zoom them in or whatever we need to do to get them to show up, because it is important for the jurors to have both sides. If you're ever lucky enough to be a juror, which I know everybody tries to get out of being a juror, but most people who sit and actually hear a case say it was a worthwhile experience, and they 90%, I'd say, come to the right conclusion.
Yeah, I think every juror who I've ever talked to after a trial has been almost thankful or appreciative for that. That's a whole other topic from our podcast today. But the
Right.
jurors who I've spoken with afterwards have they said that they enjoyed it, learned a lot, and it wasn't nearly as bad as they thought it was going to be. But back on our topic for today, if you have a really good expert as well, when it comes time to cross-examine the other expert, your expert should prep you as to the angles to take or the topics to cover,
Or your
things
weak
to look out
spots,
for. Yeah, the
be
weaknesses in your
prepared.
case, so you're ready for that.
Yeah.
And and you mentioned publications. I had a malpractice case last year that went to trial, and the defense expert published some books. So I found one of those books, and I bought it before the trial, and I brought that book to trial, and I had it stuck in my folder. So I was cross-examining this medical expert, expert in quotes, medical expert, about things that he said during the trial that didn't quite match up with what was in his book. And I was going back and forth, and then the defense attorney started objecting because he had no idea really where I was going with this, and he was saying that I was relying on hearsay, but it turned out that it wasn't hearsay because the doctor himself, the defense doctor himself, wrote those statements in the book. So I pulled the book out and I said, "Did you write a book that looks like this?" And then, and anyway, it went from there, and it was.
I wrote it
was
then, but it's not controlling now.
Right, it's
That would
different
be their
now.
Excuse,
yeah,
but
it was a fun cross-examination. But those are our war stories.
Oh yeah, got another pretty good one is economics. When you have lost wages, you project them out in the future,
Particularly
and because
for
of
somebody young, a
because somebody
high
young,
wage
and of
earner.
course inflation,
Right.
and over time, now we know what inflation's like. For the last 5 or 10 years, it seemed pretty low, but 4 or 5%. A car was $2,000 in 1965, it's now $60,000. So when you project things out 30, 40 years in the future, an economist can tell you what the effects of inflation is. So there's an expert that we've used, an economist, and he wrote a book. And the book's title is, for lawyers, How to Increase Your Damages. And so when he gets cross-examined by, isn't it a fact, the defense lawyer says that you wrote a book to help lawyers. He goes, yes, I did. And he says, I know where you're going. He goes, yes. And the title of the book is for lawyers how to increase your damages, isn't it? And he goes, yes. And I can tell by the way you said that question that you didn't read the book, because it's really to help the lawyers not to increase their damages, but to do their job. And it made a good impact on the jury, and jury used the calculations of the expert in their determination. And it's kind of interesting. But you have economists, you have, like I say, all different types of experts.
With that economist who you're referencing, oftentimes when he's our expert, the defense won't even get an expert because the math works out correctly. That's one area where there's less wiggle room because it's more based on math. And so the math works out, as your
conservative.
Economist says.
He doesn't project or pretend that the interest rate was some other number.
And sometimes the real rates are just, the rate of inflation is such that the numbers seem crazy, and you want it to be really conservative because people just turn off to it. They can't believe it. What could happen in 20 years? The effect of inflation, that's $100,000 will be $2 million.
Mm-hmm. But that's how it's going with houses, for example. Like 20 years ago in Ulster County, you could buy a nice regular house for a couple $100,000.
You can buy them for $40,000, $50,000.
Back then, right?
You're really old, Eli. Well, come on, Derek.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah. And now a house like that, it seems like it's gone up about 5 times in price over the past 20 years. Maybe even more in Ulster County and surrounding areas. And so if you tell a jury in 20 years from now, this is going to cost 5 times the amount, it seems crazy. In 20 years, a house will be $5 million. That sounds crazy, but if the rate of inflation and real estate keeps going on this trend, that's how it'll end up. So, the numbers do sometimes sound crazy when you put them out into the future, but that's how the math works out.
And it helps the jury.
Yeah.
And that's what really the purpose of the expert is, to explain things that jurors don't really have a deep understanding of, and sometimes have no reason to even think about, and they can be explained to in a way that is understandable. And if you don't have the expert, it just seems sometimes crazy. And oftentimes we'll have experts for accident reconstruction. Your client could be dead or have no memory, amnesia, and doesn't really know what happened. And you need to have an expert to explain what happened from an engineering standpoint. And they can determine what the speed was. Now we have black boxes in the cars that will tell things, but there are all kinds of different things that go into it. That the engineer, the expert can
the crush index and all those things, the speed, and they go backwards and they see if everything was working correctly. The seatbelt, sometimes the seatbelt doesn't work, or the airbag has too much force in it. Mm-hmm. So these are the kind of things lawyers investigate.
We have these major automobile crashes where the people have died and the other drivers were unconscious and have amnesia. Yeah. Nobody knows what happened.
Right.
Yeah. And you need to have experts. You have to explain it from an engineering
standpoint.
Definitely
the black boxes have gone away with that. We've gone away from that a little bit. They help explain this one was traveling 87, this one was going 37. You figure it out from there. Helps a lot.
Yeah. And then sometimes it'll be like a pipe breaks. And then you want to know whose fault it is. Sometimes it could be old and deteriorated, and you know that it should have been replaced years ago. Other times it could be a fairly new pipe was installed wrong, and sometimes you have debates over who is at fault. And insurance companies often hire under their subrogation rights for cause of a fire. Was it the toaster, or was it the person who left something on the stove?
Fell asleep with a cigarette lit or whatever it was.
And they litigate it, and it's because their house burns down, they want to find out what the cause was, and they want to get reimbursed by some manufacturer or some other company.
I had the interesting case I actually tried in New York City, because we sued the New York City Department of Environmental Department for New York City because of the tree they did not trim. And my poor client got hit with an 80-foot white pine as he was traveling down from, Ashokan. And I had to get a local tree expert to come in and testify and explain to a New York City jury, which I know I remember showing them the pictures. And they were like, oh, all those trees. Oh, it's so crowded. How could you stay up there? There's no people there. And they just felt uncomfortable. And I was glad I got a local guy up here to explain that even though there's a lot of trees, you can look for certain things. Is it rotten? How close to the roadway is it? How tall is the tree? Are there dead limbs? What are the woodpecker holes showing us? And so we've learned a lot ourselves in a practical manner. I mean, you wouldn't think you need a tree expert when a tree crashes and causes those kinds of injuries, but we did.
But the expert saved us in that case, ultimately, because the case, it was thrown out by the trial court judge originally, even though we had that expert, and then the appellate division reinstated the case. So we won the appeal and went back down to trial and settled ultimately before trial, right? You settled? Or did the trial start?
We had to try the case, and as you recall, there was a little bit of water in Manhattan at that time. We got 3 days into the trial, and we had to adjourn the case, and then Sandy came and hit New York City, so all of the court systems were closed down there for about 6 months. So we had a mistrial, and then we settled.
Okay. Well,
but I still needed that expert, and he was very local. He was very smart. He knew a lot about stuff, but you don't think, just explain to them why the tree fell. It was rotten. Yeah, well, what about this? And they could really point out that there was carelessness in not monitoring other things. So that was a good one.
And sometimes the expert starts out for the other side, and then you realize when you have a case a couple years later, that was a really good expert the defense had. Call him up. Call her or him up and use them and, flip them. And when they're really good, they're good. And sometimes they're advocates and sometimes they're scientists. And sometimes you need an advocate and sometimes you need a scientist. And, the experts that are brought in often are for the defense. And they are sometimes very, very formidable. And like in medical malpractice cases, they'll get the professor from the medical school could even have taught your doctor that you're expert. And they just one-up it. And it's...
You get very qualified doctors who will say, and take a long time and look good and explain to the jury why this is just a judgment call and therefore is not a case that you should sue and blah, blah, blah. But a lot of times when you go back and get the defense expert and hire them on a plaintiff's side, because we only do plaintiff's work, you find out that the really good experts enjoy doing both sides because it balances them out. And if they don't want to, if they'll never testify on behalf of a plaintiff or never testify on behalf of a defendant, I always feel like that's not a good sign. We always try to call the ball a ball and a strike, and that's the best way to go forward. And then it'll be up to the jury and the judge, too. The judge gets educated with our experts, too, because otherwise they kind of flounder a little bit and don't understand.
Yeah. Sometimes you know where they're going. There was one expert, neurologist, who always would say how people who are in accidents embellish things, and it's like secondary gain, which is a fancy way of saying they get money for their injuries, and therefore they're going to exaggerate. And he would like to, roll that out that it's, what they do because it's psychologically the way people react to trauma and cases, and it's litigation neurosis and blah, blah, blah.
Greedy lawyer standing next to him.
And so what I remember a case they tried, I knew how to stay away from any psychological injury to my client because it, quote, opens the door for the defense expert to then give this BS line about secondary gain and litigation neurosis. And so I stayed away from it on direct. Even though there was, some trauma, post-traumatic stress, I just kept it out of the case. And then when the defense doctor came up, I asked for the judge to rule that he's not to bring that up, not to state anything to do with psychological injury, even though neurology is related to neuropsychology. But I avoided it and direct, so it shouldn't come up out of the doctor's mouth on their expert in cross-examination. 3 times he tried to get it out. And I would go, I'd get out of my seat, and the judge would go, "Doctor, you've been told."
You.
But when they're really hard, they're hard and they're good, but you have to be aware. And when you know who the expert is, that you've had some experience cross-examine. There's a few of them I've had, I probably have cross-examined them way more than the lawyer who called them had them testify on their behalf. And it's just part of the game. And the experts, they're there to be hired. There's a certain coterie of them that are out there. They advertise. There's one notable one from upstate New York. who gave a seminar for doctors how to increase your income in your practice by being an expert witness. And, he advertised and how he's going to tell doctors how they can make some money being an expert. And, it puts things in perspective to the jury as to who they are.
And I don't mind if they're, occasionally doing it, but when it becomes their full-time job, I really think that's a great area for cross-examination. You recognize that this person doesn't have any patience, and he's making an opinion about your client who, he considers a phony baloney for whatever reason. Maybe they had a prior case, and it's not like you hide it or anything, but guys who don't, or women who don't have their own patience, who come in and try to get a jury to just believe that whatever they say is golden. A, they're not in step because they haven't been practicing in the last whatever number of years, 2-3 years. That's why I say the good doctors that you get, or the good engineers, or the people who are actually practicing and still are sharp in their field, and they're good for your case and good for your client.
And the insurance companies have unlimited assets almost, so they can hire anybody. They can bring them in from any part of the country. They can go to the best engineering schools.
Or the best toxicologist.
No, I cross-examined one who was the absolute top toxicologist in the world. Had been cited in treatises by more than anybody else by far over like a 10-year period. The textbook on toxicology was under this expert's name. And I remember he started to give his credentials in a federal case, and Maureen and myself were trying it together. And Maureen came up hours later from when he began testimony, and she couldn't believe that he was still going through his CV, his credentials.
Right.
And the judge kept looking at me to just say, we concede that he's qualified. And I would shake my head. The reason was I didn't think that they were going to call him because he was such a big deal, and they had another expert on the similar topic. I thought, they're never bringing
the local guy will come in, not the guy from California or whatever.
But so meanwhile, I had to prepare my cross-examination. and so when I cross-examined him, totally flustered, dropped all his papers, took them apart, and he, of course, taught PhD students, and I just introduced him as, with all his great credentials and how he teaches PhD students, and how the information coming in must be accurate, because if you don't, then your opinions at the other end are going to be inaccurate. And, oh, yes, I agree, and you have to scrutinize what your PhD students have as their basis. Oh, yes. And then I know he's got the history wrong. So, doctor, would you please read the history? And he wouldn't read it, because he had it wrong.
Right, the emergency room record was contradictory, and he would not admit it. It was pretty funny. But the judge was kept looking at Eli. Get this over with. Stop asking.
And the other lawyer says, you're badgering the witness. I object. And the judge kept going, no, answer that question. But you can have some fun with them. Sometimes they put a hole in your case. They blow you right away. The defense trots out an expert, and they have this bizarre theory that you never even thought about, medically speaking, and it's. But what are you going to do? That's who they are. They're out there.
Or the other problem with some experts is they use the technical stuff to the extent where it becomes like a smoke screen. And no matter how much you study as a lawyer, you're not in there with manipulation, and you're not in the surgery, so they can use terms and techniques to try to make you sound stupid, and they bamboozle the jury. And you always try to, if you are ever a jury, always listen, because the expert should be able to explain it to a 6th grade education. It doesn't have to use big words. They can explain it, and they have an opinion, and they can tell you why. That's what I work on, getting our experts or whoever we use to try to speak in a regular tone of voice. You don't have to use 95-cent words just to be a hero,
And some of them are multi-talented. I had a doctor who was an artist, and instead of having medical illustrations of the injury, we just give him an easel and a pen or a marker, and he could show how the dislocation occurred and where the fracture line was, and he would draw it, and jurors loved it.
Yeah, because you follow along as the pen is moving across the page. It draws your attention to it. It's good.
And they do charge a lot of money.
Well, they're allowed to make a living, but
$10,000-$15,000 to show up, and sometimes more. And some cases are very, very expensive, especially medical cases. You need multiple medical experts, and the defense knows that. And it's really expensive to take them on. And
plus, the big problem with that is they're the ones who create the evidence. The medical records are dictated right out of their mouth, so they don't mention some of those things that might have happened in the security of the operating suite, shall I say.
Yeah, the mistakes are never contained in the records.
They don't say, "Oh, we really screwed up." That's not what
Whoops,
they say. This
that
unusual
dropped.
case, unanticipated bleed, and blah 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 blah. And then you go to your expert, and your expert can interpret in between, I say, the white spaces and that weren't written down and what was left out. And but you would know it as a layperson. As a lawyer experienced in malpractice, you would know it. You need that particular expertise and that subspecialty to really understand it.
Right.
And like I say, sometimes they'll give you the analysis and tell you it's just not a case, even though it seems like an obvious case. The flip side again is sometimes you think, I don't know what's going on here, and the doctor says, "Oh, just missed the boat here." And but that's in med mals, you need them. You're absolutely required. You have to hire somebody. In a regular injury case, a full auto accident, New York requires that you have a doctor give an opinion as to what we call causal relationship. Some other states, you don't need an expert witness. You can just use the medical records. But New York, you need the magic words from your doctor that it's causally related, that, even though it's kind of obvious that it happened in the accident, especially like neurological cases, things like that, and that things are painful, doctor has to give the opinion. Or else, and sometimes you think, well, the person's going to get arthritis. It's kind of common knowledge. It may be common knowledge, but the law in New York requires that an expert give an opinion that there'll be future damages, that there'll be permanent injury, and the doctor has to give that opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty.
And that gives the defense the opportunity to bring in their guy or their gal to sit there and say, hey, just because they say it hurts doesn't mean it hurts. We don't have the painometer to put on anybody. So, and that's why it becomes an art form, really, as a skilled attorney. Can you elicit that testimony without putting the jury to sleep, without utilizing the language that obscures what's really the issue? We really just want them to understand it hurts when I roll over at night and I wake up and then I can't get back to sleep. Those kind of basic things that happen a lot of times to our clients in the more routine types of cases.
Now here's something that's like a trial practice kind of inside baseball thing. What you always want is the defense expert to testify after lunch. Okay. And hopefully the courtroom's warm,
but we're not drinking
and they want to
lunch,
dim
I
the
swear.
lights also, okay? Because timing is really important.
That's true.
And what happens is, unfortunately, in cases, the defense goes second, okay? Mm-hmm. And they always make out how, keep an open mind, blah, blah, blah. But what happens is that they often time it that they can't get their medical expert who's going to say there's no permanency.
They say they can't get it? You mean they actually could get them
Yeah,
there,
right.
but
Well,
they
you
say
think?
they
And
can't?
they get to testify just before we sum up. So the last witness is the defense expert. And, of course, X's out everything you proved, and it's the last thing the jury hears. And we know about primacy, first thing you hear, and then recency, the last thing you heard.
You can only pray that you got some issue to bring up on rebuttal, and maybe bring your expert back.
Your proof is done on Tuesday, and the court will say, "Oh, when can you have your doctor in?" Friday. So by that time, they're hoping that the jury will forget your proof, and that Friday morning they'll bring their doctor in, their expert witness, and they'll go over the whole case. They'll give them hypothetical, discussing all the proof, and then they'll give their opinion that you have no case. Mm. And sometimes it's timing, but this is what happens in court. And it takes sometimes the heart out of you. Once in a while you get lucky and say maybe getting a rebuttal witness in, but it's very, very rare. But it's just the way it is. The way the world is, you need expertise, you need experts, and they're expensive, and we're there to support our cases, and we invest in them to win the case and make it a level playing field.
Yeah, the right expert can really make a difference in your case, and take the wind out of the defense sails, if you will, and can put you across the finish line and make the difference between winning and losing.
Yeah, definitely.
So I guess that's it here for this episode on expert witnesses. Thanks for listening to another episode of Upstate and Litigate. We look forward to our next episode. Be sure to tune in next time and like and follow us. You can click the links down below.
And can't they tell us what they want to hear?
Yes, on some platforms you can comment below. If you have any suggestions or ideas, put a comment down below or just email one of us at the firm.